Welcome to Inside Prediction Markets. We got a guest today, our friend Nick, but first we're going to do three big stories in PMs this week. So, PolyMarket is facing an honest to God lawsuit over the settlement of the MicroStrategy to sell Bitcoin market. So, we've discussed this before. MicroStrategy, a company whose purpose is really only to, at one point, to buy Bitcoin, and now it seems more to trade Bitcoin. Um, there was a market on whether or not they would sell any by a certain date. Their report wasn't released until a day after that date, but it confirmed that they had sold before that date. The market settled to no sale, even though they did sell based on the timing, and a lot of money transacted on the market. So you see a lot of people on Twitter going on and on about how this is so wrong, I'm going to sue, but somebody has actually gone so far as to retain a lawyer and take step one on the journey to actually suing somebody over the settlement of an
Yeah.
outcome.
Well, I saw something similar from a previous guest we had, Gayton. Um, Doug, I'm butchering his Twitter name. It's always hard to pronounce, but um, I honestly support it because this a lot of this feels very like annoying and difficult. It's like if you make a trade on something and you understand these are the rules, and they either change the rules, which has happened, not from this lawsuit, I don't believe, but or they grade it on something that's not these rules after you make a trade. That's extremely annoying. Imagine you say like you make a trade on an MLB game and it's you go against the Pirates and Paul Skeens isn't pitching, so you're like, oh great, I'm gonna trade against the Pirates, and then they say, oh actually, even though your trade was confirmed for game one of the series, we're going to actually make it on game three of the series where you have to play against Paul Skeens. You'd be pretty pissed too. Doesn't matter if you win or not. They can't just change the rules or grade it on something that's not this. Or, they decide like, okay, well, even though the Pirates lost, they got more hits, so we're going to reward you know, that's what it kind of feels like. When I'm reading this, that's what I'm thinking of. And it's like, you get some of this nonsense when you deal with, you know, PMs, but like you don't have to. And I think, the other PMs got to be better about grading it. I mean, we've had our fair share of problems and whatnot, but I think as long as you make a good effort to always do what's right for the customer, if that means sometimes eating losses, or if that means just like making an annoying ruling or whatever that maybe feels unfair, but it's technically right, that's what you should be going for.
Story number two, kind of fun. Cristiano Ronaldo to cry after his last game or not. Did you see this?
Yes.
This is a good one because he visibly was, he had like crying face. Um, but people are trying to find actual tears on his face, and so they're zooming in and chopping up images and claiming, this is sweat. No, it's a tear. As of the time of recording, I don't think this market is settled, but kind of a fun one to watch. Now, again, this I think less traded on this market. Certainly less should have traded on this market. Um, and you'd have to go into it a little more clear eyed about how wide open the settlement terms could possibly be, but a similar kind of story to the last story.
Yeah, that was pretty ridiculous. I can't even believe these are real markets. I mean, can't we just trade on normal things like who's going to win the game? Not these nonsense. The third story, this is kind of a story, I guess, for us. The third story I noticed was surprisingly did not have a very large anti-USA versus Belgium position yesterday. The flow was relatively balanced. It still obviously leaned United States, and we did have. I know I can speak personally, and as you know, I guess we can cut it if we're not allowed to say. But the Novig team did have a small anti-USA position. I was expecting it to be comparable to the Mexico England game, but it was nothing like that. I am curious why you think that was. I was expecting to go in and just like take a bunch of rec flow and just like be heavily against the US, but that did not happen. It happened in most other US games. It happened in the England Mexico game, but not this Belgium news game, which is a bigger game, which I found very puzzling.
Yeah, and this is kind of the follow up story to the volume on the Mexico England match was insane and entirely on inflows on Mexico. Um, California and Texas are big states for PMs right now because OSB is illegal. High Mexican populations there. I think the American soccer fan is a little cosmopolitan and not necessarily just piling into the USA. Um, it's kind of an interesting fact finding mission and has been all year to see what kind of events have super asymmetrical public retail sides and which ones don't. And I think there have been a lot of surprises, and there will continue to be surprises, especially as we get into NFL season. It's a shame Carlos is out too, because it'd be kind of fun to see in late rounds of tennis matches. Are there big public sides? That those can often be kind of the story within the story on some of these markets.
Yeah, and that would be very fun to see as well. I mean, I'm hoping that this Djokovic center match that will be coming up will be some good volume, but I don't think it will be. But yeah, I'm curious if any. I know most other market makers were had a pro Belgium position, and I'm not saying we didn't, but what I'm just saying is like I was expecting it to be similar, if not greater size than Mexico, and and honestly, it was small enough that I was like, honestly, I just want the U.S. I'm a patriot. I want
Yeah.
the U.S. The U.S. to. If it got big enough, then I would root against the country. I'm not gonna lie, but it wasn't that big, so we can be pro America.
All right.
Is it
Up
we can call
next.
it emotional hedge.
Yeah. Up next, Optic Odds Hot Seat. We have Nick.
For this week's Inside Prediction Markets, we have my good friend Nick, aka Bluebeard. He is joining us anonymously because um, he just got absolutely posterized in a pickup basketball game and is hiding his face out of shame. But we thank you for joining us, Nick.
And he's joining us in the Optic Odds Hot Seat, as always.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me on. I'm sure if you follow Chris, you saw the score was 11-3. We're going to be doing we're getting a gym and bet bash though, so there's going to be a lot more. It's going to be a lot higher stakes. There's going to be no woman's ball. There's going to be no collapsing backboards. So we're kind of treating that as a warm up session.
So for a little backstory before we get into like the real meat of this, just of what happened. Nick works with myself, my old betting group and whatnot. And this vacation we had in Florida was just the last betting hurrah as I'm parting ways, going focused on novig and anything. But a couple months ago, Nick was talking mad shit in the group chat, saying that he would take anyone one on one. And as soon as he gets a challenger, he backs down in person, says he doesn't want to play. It was a previous guest we had on, actually, Jake, and then our friend Peanut Butter decides to take him up on it just as a fun game, and Nick is so happy to do it. But when the real competition, Jake, shows up, he backs down and is had all sorts of excuses. He was able to beat Peanut Butter, but unfortunately, the real competition he was too scared for. Nick, care to comment?
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate your point of view. I think you remember things a little bit differently, and I think this gets into a deeper topic if this is a safe space for mental health. But
Oh God.
yeah, basically, I mean, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of injuries and a lot of years of inactivity ago, basketball is probably the thing I felt like I was best at. I took the most pride in, and you know, I felt very good about it. I don't think I've really, my ego has been separated from the 6 or 7 years of reality that's happened since then. And it's a tough thing to where anytime someone says that they think that they can beat me, when like, I know consciously that I'm not really that great anymore, but they still have to be better than who I was 7 years ago for me to even come close to accepting the fact that that might be true. So, in reality, there's some dudes I would have killed 7 years ago who challenged me. I correctly told them that they would not, and then things happened, and We're going to be playing indoors at Bet Bash. I can still give my full effort for a game or two, but things are a lot different than they were. And, give it another 5 years, I think my ego will realize that.
Fair. Well, speaking of ego and backstory, let's get your backstory. Obviously, I know you quite well, but I don't think Henry knows you nearly as well as I do, and the audience definitely doesn't know you as well. So, why don't you bring it back to how you started, and then eventually up to what you just showed me this vacation where you're going on PMs. So, if you give the
Yeah.
whole backstory, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I have a extensive. I'll keep it short, but I have an extensive background with chronic pain and back injuries and basically playing doctor roulette and things over the course of about the past 7 years now. And I was an accounting major in college. Just went on to get a pretty normal business 9 to 5 job, and I was having trouble like sitting down basically. And once COVID ended, they wanted us to be in person like full time to where like I couldn't be doing a lot of the stuff from my bed whenever my back was hurting like I previously was. So I basically just had to go on indefinite like medical leave with the hopes of like coming back was always it, but it was more just I was spending time like visiting doctors and really not on work stuff. So I had that job only for about a year, and I went on medical leave and basically spent the next like 2 years just visiting doctors and doing like a whole lot of like absolutely nothing else in terms of like productive, at least. I was just listening to a bunch of podcasts like 10 hours a day, which I still do. And yeah, just exploring like random things. It wasn't really like I was in just like a completely different place, and was hoping that I would be able to go back to work sooner or later, but it continues to be a challenge. And like I still am in a pretty similar position, but I never made progress as to where like going back was even like something I had been considering. But then, yeah, about 2.5 years after that, betting became legalized in North Carolina, which was March 11th, 2024, which is the day I would say that I had been a part of the workforce since then. And, it's a pretty, like, from there it goes a pretty typical story to, like, what you've heard a million times of, like, they're doing the most aggressive advertising ever, trying to capture, like, market share in a new state. And yeah, I was just doing the bonus stuff. Like it didn't take me long to just find like the like how to just like use a promotion effectively, basically just by hedging it. And starting out with like almost no bankroll, you can still like hedge it even with the bare minimum. And then you start doing that for friends and family. I was burning through like you know I wasn't really doing much anything advanced at this point in time, but uh, you know you start to I thought the sports books were completely unbeatable, and then you start to realize like I think it took me like at least 6 months of just not even attempting to like bet anything good, just like bet profit boost bonus bets, like things of that nature, that there was like a lot of opportunity to do things not with that. And so I kind of just went down the like I never really got into anything originating, but I joined the Crazy Ninja Mike Discord, which shout out to them because they served a pretty big part of my journey. But basically learned about devigging, and it kind of went from there. It was just a lot of stuff that like if you put into accounts now, none of you would, because it's just like we're all hitting the same bet a million times for like 5% edge and like betting on like a limited FanDuel and stuff, and like it's a lot of like the rookie stuff, but it was really good. It was really good learning things. And then after doing that for coming up on a year is when the was when probably brings us to like February of 2025 when the Spaces era started kicking off, and dealt with some pretty tumultuous things during that, but take it or leave it. I'd have to take it, pretty much every time, because we met. I heard Chris going on there talking a good bit, and I had DM'd him and a few other guys, probably guys who are going to listen, who definitely just didn't respond. But Chris, he is somebody who takes advantage of the opportunity and saw that I was ripe for a little more infrastructure to start squeezing a little bit more out of some of these opportunities. And then From there, I kind of met a bunch of people who are operating at a higher level than I was, who I think I believe that I would have met, but definitely not as soon as I was able to, just with leveraging like the network as quickly as I was able to. And then, um, yeah, I mean, we Chris basically helped me like just kind of pour fuel on the fire, more or less, and then um, yeah, it's just kind of branched into a bunch of other things. Like since then, I mean, this industry stuff changes every like 3 months, so you have to just keep like reinventing it. And I guess that kind of brings us more to we still work together in some capacity, but there's a lot more of that work now that I'm doing on my own, on prediction markets. And um, that's kind of been like the fun puzzle the past few months. And with like the World Cup volume right now, it's feels good that I have spent the past like 3 months just spending 12 hours a day arguing with Claude, because there's something to show for it at this point in time now.
Okay, so obviously I've seen what you've built on the PMs, but Henry, our audience has not. Can you explain like exactly what it is you're doing? Are you doing RFQ? Are you doing straights? Are you doing live pregame? What's your whole goal? What are you trying to do? Taker maker?
Yeah, so it the it really never started off as like the project that ended up just like being where I spend most of my time now. But it was really like I was it's not the hardest thing in the world to see one of these like super liquid games that sometimes maybe people are even putting up a nice synthetic wall to where everyone and their mom is just getting filled at like 4.5% EV on something near a coin flip, and you can pretty much get as much size as you want, and it's a fun time. So that was basically that was kind of what I was doing manually. But in doing that, anybody who's done it enough, which is I'm sure a lot of people still do it manually. It's like it's fine, but like you will step away from the screen and then 10 minutes later see the notification that like your full order, like nothing worse than seeing that kalshi notification of like basically all the shares you posted got filled in like one click. And then you're at lunch like pulling up like an odds screen, like what are the odds this was just some whale and not some market move that I was just like eating a crab dip during it happening. And so like it basically just with like how like especially like I was like trying to do some of the NBA stuff. It's like you really can't be doing NBA like without just like sitting there watching it. Like one player gets like out and you get one clicked, and then if like something like goes your way, you already have to wait in the queue. So then like there's just going to be like three layers above you that like start filling. So like it's just adverse selection at its finest, to where like I can tell you even still like I make the mistake, but like I paid to tell you when like Holland got ruled out that third game like quicker than anyone else who was tweeting about it. I had a front row seat. So there's like times where
Wait, did you get crushed on that Holland news when Norway decided to sit everyone versus France?
yeah, and I honestly can't remember too many of the details around it. I just remember like getting one clicked, and then I go like just every time I just go put the name into like the name of the game into Twitter, and I always just see like when I'm doing it back to back, 18 seconds ago this happened. So I can't remember. Can't remember like the details around it, but that kind of situation is like that like theme, especially with NBA, is like even like more common. And um, like with the World Cup now, the knockout stage, it's like things are a little cleaner. Those like first like round of group games were pretty scary, just because like there's a lot of just like how do you like there just like was a lot of like uncertainty of having not seen anyone. And like some of the moves were insane. Like I remember I was posting like the Columbia money line steaming like 80 or 90 cents with like an hour and a half till game time. So I think I had even been getting got a lot at the beginning, because you come to think that like, oh, Pinnacle's limit is like 200K, like surely that counts for something if I'm sticking it in at like a 6 cent arb. And then you can easily just like I'm getting filled even when it is still an arb, like very happy with the fill. And then I like look at like the XROI based on just like a DVIG close, and it's like negative 12% somehow, and it's like, all right, like that's fine. And kind of like the joke I've been making is like the game's really just like, at least with World Cup, with how much it was steaming in the group stage, it's like try and get your money in when it's like, like if it's on a coin flip, hopefully you're getting a few percent expected value. And then just hope that when the last hour comes, when it steams like 12%, it goes your way. Because that's going to like kind of decide it regardless if it's a good bet or a bad bet. But at least if you get the 3% ARB, with an hour to go, you can at least feel like you made a good decision while you're holding the bag. But like, if you start out 3% ahead, you're going to be on the right side of it more times than not. There's just, a lot of like variance that makes you just like want to question everything when you don't even know the names of these guys or understand why it's moving so much. So, um, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I think the thing I should have said first was like, besides just like, I was basically deciding that I wanted to. This basically led me to decide that I need something to cancel my liquidity whenever the market steams. So, there's like some pretty basic ways to do that of just like, oh, what's Pinnacle at? Can I like wire this correctly to like move on Steam? Make a market average based on like who I perceive as sharp in this market, and then, set some kind of like, you can set some kind of like, you can basically create your own like dynamic fair value that's just always changing, and you're like, okay, if it's a minus 170 fair, like, I don't want to enter before it's minus 155, and then if it gets, if it moves against me, then cancel. So kind of my thinking was to keep it super simple and just like, I'll just post all these manual orders I'm doing already. But if it like, I'll set a threshold, like if it cancels before me, just like pull me out so I don't get one clicked, was really my thinking. And then from there, like, when you kind of go down that road, you want to err on the side of caution with like I would rather be over canceling based on like, it barely crossing the threshold, or maybe like even Pinnacle's going to get like bought back. And you like, there's a lot of times where like if I was sitting there looking at it, I'm like, I wish it didn't cancel it. Like that wasn't really significant. But like for this purpose, I would rather just like, if it's even like a question and I'm not like, watching it, I would rather cancel. So then I realized like the rate that it was canceling was like, okay, I'm still leaving a good bit on the table. So, just trying to use pretty similar threshold logic to like join the queue based off of. And then there's some other like, trying not to strictly rely on the API, like the like kalshi order book, has a lot of like information like within it a lot of the times. So using some like whatever metrics you can derive from that to like kind of arrive to a confidence level, to pair with your like to pair with a fare that you kind of deem beforehand, and then just having to like spending a lot of time scaling it like market by market, and just like letting like a lot of the limits and liquidity in the market already like kind of help dictate like what confidence threshold that you can like put yourself at for that game
Yeah.
whenever you're putting up size and like thresholds for canceling.
Nick, you talked about, you want to see the game steam your way close to game time, and obviously you never want to buy the top, but do you feel like, because we've kicked around this conversation a bit, do you feel like there's so much retail inflow into prediction markets in the World Cup right now that some of these closing lines are perhaps less accurate than the lines are earlier in the life cycle?
Yeah, that's a question that I think I would rather hear people like smarter than me talk about, but I think it's pretty timely because the best example is probably to point out is Mexico, and like that Mexico game, because we're recording this on Tuesday, was that Sunday now or Saturday? Like Mexico versus England. I mean, that was like pretty much as good of a, like an example of potentially what you're saying, and also just like the entire reason I like built this thing out, because like I'm not trying to compete against the best market makers or anything. I'm just trying to find like, okay, where's the like retail flow to this degree coming in, and then like how can I be on the like receiving end of it. I don't need to be doing the most like advanced strategies to to capture it in all these ways and stuff. And but some of it's just so easy. So like with Mexico, that ended up being like one of those spots where I would say like I ended up just holding like not a good price at all, just because it just kept moving and moving, and I was like the day before like trying to empty my account on kalshi. And um, you know I like to have like with the strategy I'm taking, because I don't really have any like true like alpha or whatever. Like you kind of just take the like you take the good spots as they come, and like there's not a lot limiting you on size, especially if you have like other outs. So like with Mexico, to me, the perfect strategy is just to like see if I can get my entire like Kalshi balance in play, and then like worry about the rest later before the game, even though it's like significantly more risk than I would be comfortable taking on. Like you
Well,
can.
so wait. We say worry about the risks later on. Expand. Like, no, I think a lot of people might be confused by that.
Yeah, no, uh basically I was taking on like I had uh, a part of my bankroll that I would definitely not be comfortable with on a single wager in on Mexico, because it was like I think I was getting like 6% EV on Kalshi, and I knew that the flow I knew like just the volume on this game was going to be insane. So I'm priming some, whether it's like priming legal accounts the other way or going on other exchanges, and even like novig, like the main function that I have for it isn't really trying to capture retail flow, um, because I'm not sure if it exists. No offense, but but I'm just but like letting their market make a team, like letting your market make a team like beat me out of 1% on the other way coming back. And like I kind of know, there's a point where like specifically novig's probably like the easiest place for me to do it, is where you guys will buy it back. It doesn't need to be 6% like I'm getting on kalshi to get bought out. So I'm like, if I can get half my roll in on 6%, and then which I don't know if I quite did, but then like between all the accounts I'm priming, or between giving it back to you guys at like -1% expected value, it's still like a no-brainer play to do. And then my main job is just spending the next day playing like transfer roulette, because I'm just getting all my balance, or all my winnings are very like one-sided and stuff. But yeah, that answers it, right?
Yeah, I just want to quick point out to anyone listening, if anyone else finds themselves in a similar situation and wants to offload some risk, we would love to accept that. Although we would ask for a little bit more than -1%. Market makers have to eat too. We have family to support as well. But yeah, it's just thank you for that, Nick.
Yeah. Um, so I guess keep basically from there, once you get the like entry and exit thing to a place you're comfortable with, like you don't need to be a genius to capture like the lowest hanging fruit, like for example that Mexico game. But um but there's a lot of like extra work you can do to like try and just capture more and more, that like isn't really like nearly as like your hourly on like doing so won't be like worth like the initial value of like capturing like these really really good games. Another one I remember is the Super Bowl. Like Kalshi was like after maker fees, I was getting like -189 when like the money line fair was like I believe -210. And it's really nice, like I mean, first on Kalshi it's pretty obvious it's rec flow when it's like coming in such small increments. And then also like you can just do the math on like, okay, well, what price are they taking it at? And like I think the taker fees, they were getting like +178 or something. So that's how I like check my math a lot of, or not check my math, but like check my confidence level. Like I'll like even today there was like a baseball game I got like one clicked on, and then I'm like, okay, well, with taker fees, like what price did they get? And then I'm like, okay, this has to be either like a whale or like some kind of like end boss who can beat the market at like 5 to 10 cents worse. So you know in either one of those two scenarios, like that's probably fine unless it's happening too much. But you just it makes you think that it's not the latter when it's so much worse. You would think that they would probably not be doing it on Kalshi.
So you were able to code up some basic tools to manage risk. Do you think you're going to go further in that direction? Do you see yourself building more like sophisticated software tools, or are you ultimately going to be a manual grinder first and foremost?
Um, well, now it's like automated as to where like I'm quoting pretty much all of the like pretty much all major sports, like just money line spreads and totals. Um, More or less, if Pinnacle has the line, then there's a pretty good chance that I do too. And so I'm doing like the entering it, like most of it is automated. But like the manual part it comes in a lot on like when a game like Mexico is happening. Like I basically am just like, okay, like I'm on the Mexico game today, and the rest that's happening outside of it, because I have like risk parameters to where the like automation thing isn't allowed to put my entire balance in on something, but like I will just like I have it like built out in there to where like I will just manually like do that and still like have like cancellation metrics to like try and just if I can just get the balance in on one play that like I know is good and then get out on the other side, like I'd rather do that than like I mean that's just like the easiest like uh way to basically like get the balance in play on that given day. But like the next step would probably be I don't know. I've wasted so much time like with Claude and stuff. Like it's the next step would probably be like RFQs, but um, I've done some sampling with it, and first I know there's like people who like I don't know how to code at all. I know there's people with like their own numbers who are going to have a huge edge over me. Their own like who actually know how to code who are going to have like an edge over me. Like people who actually have you know a trading team who's like more hands on with like actual market dynamics per game who are going to have like an edge over me. So like the RFQs just adds like an extra layer of complexity that like something like you know Fade Mexico doesn't really require. And like the nice thing is that like if you have the capital to like get out on the other side and other outs, and especially if you're using a bunch of other books that you don't mind putting some negative plays into just to keep up appearances and stuff, then like if you're getting your entire balance in on a few percent EV, like yeah, with the RFQs, if you're coming up with your own numbers as to where you can like shade it earlier in the day and stuff, like you can probably like I don't doubt that you couldn't get like a higher like EV threshold than me. But I don't know. I'm not really. I kind of know my lane, and I just, I'm not really trying to compete with like, you know, groups like what I assume you guys will be doing, or other groups that are going to have like originators and software engineers and people who are manually focused on games constantly and stuff. Like it would be silly to think that like I'm just gonna like code my way to the Holy Land with that. But like the nice thing about like kalshi, at least for right now, is like you don't really need to be a genius to like still capture a lot of that rec flow and stuff. Like it seems like with these games like Mexico, it's like the volume is just so much. Like they're it's like back to the question you were saying earlier, Henry. Like yeah, it feels pretty like realistic that like the reason the Mexico price offering just keeps getting like worse and worse is because like I mean a day before the game I had already like pretty much like maxed out my risk, and then I'm watching it still move like still where I could have offered like Mexico at a worse price, and I'm like damn, I should have like waited and stuff. But I think there's a whole lot of like when they're I checked the night before at like 2 a.m. and there was like 23, 25 million like volume on the game, not even day of, or I guess technically day of. And it's like, how many other guys like me or, bigger groups are already like getting, a lot of fills like on Kalshi there and like, maybe on other prediction markets as to where when I don't remember what it was approaching like when the game started, but like I wasn't just like in a Mexico all you can eat buffet still, eventually everyone has to like, turn the lights off and beg Novig for 1% the other way. So I mean that would make sense to me. It's hard to like ever it's hard to ever know for sure, but like I mean just based on the logic that I used to like get my fill and how I had to quit early, like it makes perfect sense that like, when it's so one-sided, it's really hard to just, stomach everything in perpetuity.
So something you said earlier, I'm curious about. You said, you'd rather be quick to, you know, kill an order and get out of the queue if it crosses a certain threshold and whatnot. But I've always held a different belief, which is I want to be very, very, to use a poker term, nitty or conservative with that because the queue is so valuable. There's often times where you could have millions of contracts ahead of you, and or you're never getting filled if you leave the queue. So if you don't stick with it, you're never going to get filled, and maybe it'll come back or move the other way. Maybe there's a bad data feed or whatnot. I mean, if you're using you know Optic Odds, that'll probably never happen. But some weaker data feeds, maybe it will. So why do you disagree with that logic there? Like, why are you so eager to get out of the queue if the queue is so valuable? Because you just said, there's tons of volume and with tons of size on these PMs as well.
I think I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it's like a different strategy for different, I mean, we use the term market maker super liberally. Like, me calling myself a market maker and then you guys having 15 traders on the scene with, your Series Z doesn't really like put everything in like equal footing. So like, if I'm you guys, my like threshold would be significantly lower than what my personal risk threshold would be as to what I think would be a better strategy for you, Chris, if you're doing it personally rather than, with like institutional cash. But like the kind of the nice thing is, and like the luxury, like, I'm not entirely sure y'all will have is like, I, I can be a lot more just like nitty with what I play because like, if there's a day where the Mexico thing like comes up and granted that's not every day, but like with the NFL, it's like I don't need to play every NFL game on the board. Like maybe I get a couple good fills on, whatever, but then the Sunday night football like volume is insane. I get my like, I can get like you can pretty much always if you're just like a person you can pretty much always get your entire account like on it like they're doing like six figures in volume and so I just said six figures I meant like over 100 million in volume like is what feels like maybe Sunday night football can do like pregame once like kalshi keeps going with some of the advertising that they are doing but um but like I think that makes like perfect sense but if I'm like someone if it's like a bigger group who's getting who's like just has to eat a bigger like part of the pie than I do then like I think the approach would just be completely different.
The last question we like to ask people is, what's the biggest mistake you've ever learned or had while doing PMs? I'm sure you've got some good ones, considering the thing that you've built is all very conservative and uh, trying to protect against big mistakes.
Lessons written in blood, as they say.
Yeah. um I would think that like since I've started just using AI to code when I have like no coding, there would be more like horror stories about like flipping a spread or something like that. But I would say that my biggest mistake is all really what happened before I was building this because like it took me a lot of proof of concept to feel like comfortable to stop doing like the one contract like proof of like working or whatever before I even like deployed this. So I probably like could have rolled this out sooner than I did, and then ate some more of the mistakes. But like all of the mistakes I can think of, and it's like really the like reason that I even started this is like trying to do these like manual orders and like getting excited of like oh I can do just looking at some game with like an odd screen pulled up like okay I could like put up a price here for me that's like maybe the fill would be at like full Kelly and then this would be like good or whatever and then it's just and then it moves and then you just get one clicked and it's like all of my mistakes were basically like not being able to like I'm not camping out each one of these games like hitting cancel on Steam or on news and so it was just like kind of like I don't really have like one that really sticks out. It was just like death by a million paper cuts of just like, the like even when you are like market making on kalshi on these main lines, the XROI, you're never getting like a game like at the time you get in, you're not getting in at like 10 to 15% EV on like a main line at like near plus 100. So, if you're getting a bunch of like plus 2% bills like as planned, and then some NBA player gets injured and you get like one clicked, and now you're holding like negative 12%, and like the amount that you have to overcome, like the amount that the adverse selection like makes you like battle uphill is just very like it's very uneven compared to like when things do go well. So it was probably just a couple months of just like treading water of the manual workflow.
Makes
Well,
sense.
Nick, thank you very much for joining us. Will we see you next month at Bet Bash?
Yes,
You coming in?
I will be there, and if anybody wants to hoop it, me, Mr. Peanut Butter,
That's right. That's right.
and you guess you had Jake on. I wasn't sure if I could say his name, but we'll be getting a gym and sending out some invites for to figure out who has the best jump shot on gambling Twitter. Right now, I think it's me 1, NBA Green Beans 2, and then Jake 3. So we're gonna kind of get this flattened out here soon.
That's an all-time terrible list for what it's worth, but I'll let you believe whatever you
Well,
want.
me and me and ADR have some high stakes board games scheduled
Oh
for the same
God,
block of time. So
I'm I would back you, Henry, because I know you're a hustler and you're just trying to lure him in. But ADR is way smarter than you, so I'm backing ADR.
yeah, and he's really good at games,
Yeah.
like literally professional.
Yep.
All right, Nick, thanks for coming by, man.
Thanks, Nick.
Good
Appreciate you
talking to
guys. Take care.
Yeah.